Welcome back. Today I thought it'd be fun to talk about the state of FEH and their type of skills that they keep introducing into the game. Obviously there are some skills that may not hold up nowadays, even some that came out and were just dead on arrival. I figured it'd be interesting to talk about what makes a skill good and whether or not it's healthy. Healthy in the sense of whether or not it's balanced or if it's absurdly overtuned or it's just, again, dead on arrival. I want to talk about these types of things because I think it's interesting. However, I should preface this by saying this is probably going to be mostly subjective. The value of a skill will greatly differ in many people's eyes, but I think there's plenty to discuss. And with that out of the way, we may as well just get started. Starting with the question, what defines a healthy skill? In my opinion, a healthy skill is something that has counterplay, something that isn't just you have it, you automatically win. A couple of examples that come to mind are Sturdy Impact and No Follow-Up. Sturdy Impact provides a good amount of stats and prevents any sort of follow-up attack from the foe if they initiate combat. This is a skill that actually has quite a bit of use against units with guaranteed follow-up attacks or units that lack any sort of no follow-up or anything of the sort, but it does have counterplay, and I think that's one of the biggest aspects to whether or not a skill is healthy or not. Sturdy Impact, for example, it shuts down any sort of follow-up attack, but there are means around it. No follow-up can just shut it down entirely, meaning that if you are able to naturally double and you get hit by an impact and you're running no follow-up, then you don't have to worry about the skill whatsoever. You also have skills that grant guaranteed follow-up, such as Select Fighter, any sort of fighter skill, maybe even something that's built into your weapon. This is also worth noting considering the fact that a guaranteed follow-up does cancel out the impact effect, meaning that it does just become a speed check, which does again come into the idea of having counterplay. Having a skill that just works for the sake of it without any sort of counter is something that I do find to be a bit of a problem. I find that the reason that Sturdy Impact in particular is one of those skills that is very balanced is mainly because it comes at opportunity costs. So for example, if you're running no follow-up on a speedy generic sword, which means you have to give up something to run it. And this all ties back to opportunity cost, which is what I believe helps balance skills. That being said, despite how good of a skill no follow-up is, that also has counterplay of its own. For example, while it doesn't have as much counterplay as something like Sturdy Impact does, it can be countered by running skills that lower the foe's speed, maybe with lulls or tempo, or whatever the case may be. So simply having the ability to outspeed them will nullify the effects of no follow-up in a lot of cases. We keep seeing more and more instances of units being able to bypass stuff like no follow-up, despite that sounding kind of weird because you don't really bypass no follow-up, you're mainly just outspeeding them, which in turn is kind of a counter, but the idea here is that there is counterplay to it. Another popular skill in the game is Menaces, and that has plenty of counters too, whether that's with skills such as Slick Fighter, or Unity, or even Saves. It is one of those skills that has a lower floor, but a higher ceiling for damage output, depending on the menace you use, of course. But again, similar to all the other skills, it's not the end-all be-all of just skills. It works when it needs to, but it also has plenty of counters to stop it in its tracks, so it doesn't seem as overpowered as it may be. And outside of that, there's also Disarm Trap, which is really good for Aether Raids purposes, but does have the opportunity cost of a better B slot. For example, a lot of the time you could always just smite in the unit and just set off the trap so they don't waste their action. But with Disarm Trap, you have a lot more freedom in what you're able to do with that unit, and you aren't taking an action with another unit to set off the trap. But for example, if you wanted to run something like Special Spiral, Blazing Wind, Yuri, you will have the risk of traps to deal with. But if running Disarm Trap, you have more safety, but you lose the ability to loop it, which means his damage output is going to be significantly less overall. And in my opinion, these are the types of skills that seem healthy in this type of meta. However, this is probably not what you came here for. Let's talk about the skills that obviously weren't well thought out. In my opinion, one of the worst things you could do to balance stuff in a game is just introduce something that completely negates an effect. And while that may seem hypocritical with skills such as no follow-up, there is counterplay to that by having more speed. False Start, on the other hand, does not have counterplay. You could potentially stack more res, but given how much base res Elamine comes with, the amount of res you need just to set off False Start, and the skills she could get access to means that False Start is pretty much uncounterable at the moment because there are too many things going in her favor. Most units in the game don't have the type of res stat that she does, and the ones that do don't have the effects that she nullifies anyway. So you can run a Winter Fae, for example, and she has a lot of res. But what does that matter? She doesn't have anything that she needs to counter Winter Fae for. If we're talking about stuff like Bridal Catry, on the other hand, or Duma, then she just completely outright negates it. And in my opinion, that's pretty poor game design. You also have stuff like Canto Remaining with Far Trace. Far Trace is one of those weird skills that works on certain types of movement, but doesn't work on other ones. Because it's Canto Remaining and not Canto Remaining +1, it's going to make it harder for you to retreat and perform hit and run strategies. Cavalry have a bit more leeway because they have 3 movement, but for flyers, it's going to be outright near impossible because it's going to be extremely rare where they're going to be able to take advantage of the extra movement they would gain from trace, which in my opinion makes it one of those skills that's not exactly the most well thought out, but isn't exactly groundbreaking or broken either. It just kind of exists for flyers, extra stats, whoop-de-doo, but for Cavs, at least I have a bit more leeway. You also have Distant Pressure, which in my opinion was probably one of the worst skills they introduced because of the chip damage that comes with it. One of the reasons you would want to stack speed is because of skills such as Spurn, or anything that grants damage reduction based on speed. So coming out with a skill that inflicts chip damage on the user, diminishing their overall bulk, is counterintuitive to the idea of having damage reduction, which is why in my opinion it's not a really well thought out skill. And then you have saves, which in my opinion is one of those double-edged swords where if they didn't come out with something for armors, then I don't believe they'd be functional in this meta or at all, and this allows them to be functional. But I do think the fact that it is too ranged is what makes it absurdly broken, especially given that you can run double saves and just protect all your allies and you don't really have to worry about most skills in the game outside of a select few. But even then, there are specific armors that can bypass it, such as Ascended Fiorm who can bypass fire sweep effects. But that's a discussion for another time. In my opinion, this is one of those instances of great design, poor execution. Now, I'm also not going to pretend to be an expert on this game when it comes to balance, because I'm not, and I'm not going to pretend I am. However, I do think that they could have done something with saves to make it a bit more balanced, whether that was reducing it to 1 space so you don't have the ability to stat ball like crazy. For example, you could always just run double save and then bring someone like Kinshi Hinoka and then just have an absurd amount of stats going for everybody. But again, I'm not an expert on game design or anything of the sort, but I don't think it was very properly executed. Even with that being the case, I think if they were to come out with a skill that just negates saves, I think that would even be worse, because now we're in a meta that just heavily relies on save units. That being said, they may be able to come out with something that balances it, quote unquote, to an extent, because if there's one thing intelligent systems can do is introduce the poison and sell the solution. For the longest time, I believe Kanto was probably one of the most imbalanced things they could have added to the game. And just recently with the addition of Medius came Kanto Control, which I believe is a healthy counter to the ever-prevalent Kanto. Because movement is a really big thing in this game, but one of the biggest issues with someone like Yuri, for example, is that they can go in, hit and run, no consequence whatsoever. And then they can also be protected by saves in the end. However, with Kanto Control, now you can just stop it in their tracks. However, this also has counterplay. If you were to take out Medius, for example, then Kanto Control will not go off. So this isn't just Kanto dead, blah blah blah. This balances it quite a bit in my opinion. And then outside of that, you had damage reduction skills, which for the longest while didn't really have too many counters until they started introducing stuff like Deadeye, Lethality, or even Young Innis. Now, damage reduction in and of itself also came in an opportunity cost because you would be losing out on stuff like no follow-up, or you would be outsped. However, you had instances such as Spring Mar, who just had flat damage reduction. And I don't believe that was really the best approach. It's a lot more balanced nowadays because there's so many skills and units that just negate any sort of damage reduction. However, at the time, I don't believe it was as balanced as it could have been. And even then, it wasn't nearly as dumb as something like False Start. However, they could always come up with something to balance it, but right now I don't really have my hopes up. In my opinion, there are plenty of skills in the game that are properly balanced when introduced, plenty of skills that aren't balanced when introduced, and it's skills that just get balanced over time. But at the end of the day, there's no real one specific unit that doesn't have any sort of counter. But if you have to build a dedicated unit just to watch out for that one specific unit, then maybe there's a problem. But you have to let me know what you think down below. Do you agree with any of the things I'm saying? Do you disagree with any of the things I'm saying? Let me know down below. And until next time, thanks for watching.